He was born during an earthquake. The date was March 4, 1678, and the tremor that shook Venice on the day of Antonio Vivaldi's birth was severe enough that he was baptized at home the same afternoon, by a midwife, because his parents were not sure he would survive the night. He had a chest condition, probably asthma. That would trouble him for the rest of his life, occasionally preventing him from completing a mass, once reportedly causing him to leave the altar mid-service to write down a musical idea that had come to him. He survived the night, and the week, and 63 years after it. In those years he composed more than 500 concertos, nearly 50 operas, and enough vocal and sacred music to fill libraries. He was ordained as a Catholic priest, which in Venice in 1703 was both a career and a social position, but his primary vocation was always music. His red hair, inherited from his father, a barber who became a violinist at St. Mark's Basilica, gave him the nickname that followed him through his life, Il Prete Rosso. The Red Priest. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly devout one. Venice, the city that made him. To understand Vivaldi, you have to understand Venice at the turn of the 18th century, a city that was simultaneously declining as a political and commercial power and reaching its absolute peak as a musical one. The city had more opera houses per capita than anywhere else in Europe. Music was embedded in its civic and religious life in ways that had no parallel elsewhere. The Great Basilica of St. Mark, where Vivaldi's father played violin, had been a center of musical innovation since the 16th century. The city's 4 charitable institutions for orphan and illegitimate girls, the Ospedali, maintained orchestras and choirs of professional quality and charged admission for their performances, which were among the most sought-after concerts in Europe. Vivaldi's father Giovanni Battista was good enough at the violin to secure a position at St. Mark's, and he recognized early that his son was considerably better than he was. Antonio's training began at home, continued under various Venetian masters, and culminated in ordination to the priesthood in 1703, the same year he was appointed violin teacher at the Ospedale della Pietà, the most musically distinguished of the 4 ospedali. He was 25 years old. The Pietà, a laboratory for a genius. The Ospedale della Pietà was not, primarily, a charitable institution in the way that phrase implies today. It was a music school of the highest order that happened to admit orphaned and illegitimate girls as its students. Its performers were trained from childhood to professional levels of virtuosity, its ensemble was considered one of the finest in Italy, and its concerts, performed by the girls behind lattice screens that concealed their identities from the audience, attracted visitors from across Europe who came to Venice specifically to hear them. For Vivaldi, the Pietà was something close to ideal, a permanent, high-quality ensemble for which he was required to compose new music constantly, with the freedom to experiment with form, instrumentation, and technique in ways that a composer working for a single patron or a fixed theatrical season could not. He held the position, with some interruptions, for most of his adult life. The majority of his instrumental concertos were written for the Pietà's musicians, and the specific strengths and preferences of individual players shaped what he wrote. When a particular violinist had an exceptional upper register, Vivaldi wrote music that went there. When a bassoonist joined the ensemble with unusual facility, he wrote concertos for bassoon. The music was always in conversation with the people who would play it. European travelers who attended the Pietà's concerts left accounts of the experience that suggest something between a musical performance and a ritual encounter. The girls were invisible behind their screens, the music emerged from apparent emptiness into the church's acoustics, the effect on audiences was described repeatedly as overwhelming. Vivaldi's reputation spread across the continent through these performances long before his published works became widely available. The Concerto. Vivaldi's Revolution. Before Vivaldi, the dominant form of orchestral music was the concerto grosso, a form in which a small group of soloists, the concertino, alternated and competed with the full ensemble. The form had been brought to its highest expression by Arcangelo Corelli and George Muffet, and it was structured around the interplay of instrumental choirs rather than the drama of a single voice against many. Vivaldi did not invent the solo concerto. Earlier composers had used the form, but he defined it, standardized it, and made it the central vehicle of Baroque instrumental music. His concertos settled into a three-movement structure that would organize instrumental music for the next century, a fast opening movement built on a recurring orchestral theme, the ritornello, that alternated with episodes of solo virtuosity, a slow middle movement of lyrical intensity focused almost entirely on the soloist's expressive capacity, and a fast finale that returned to the energy of the opening with additional technical demands. Within this framework, the relationship between the solo instrument and the orchestra was essentially dramatic, a conversation, a competition, sometimes a confrontation, always a negotiation between individual voice and collective response. He extended the technical demands on string players beyond anything previously written. High positions that had rarely been used became standard. Complex bowing patterns, rapid arpeggios, double stops, and new techniques of tone production that had no established names entered the vocabulary of violin playing through his music. Other composers followed. Johann Sebastian Bach, who transcribed more than a dozen Vivaldi concertos for keyboard and organ, wrote in his notebooks that he was studying Vivaldi specifically to understand the logic of musical argument. How a theme could be stated, developed, varied, and resolved across the duration of a movement. The Four Seasons, a program for the world. The four violin concertos that Vivaldi published in 1725 as part of a collection called Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invention, the contest between harmony and invention, were not his most technically demanding works, or his most harmonically adventurous, or even his most structurally refined. They were, and remain, his most famous, and the reason is simple: they are the most immediately comprehensible large-scale orchestral works in the repertoire. They describe the world. They describe it with a specificity and a physical accuracy that makes the music function almost as a recording of experience rather than an interpretation of it. Each of the four concertos, spring, summer, autumn, winter, was accompanied by a sonnet, attributed by most scholars to Vivaldi himself, that described what the music was representing. The scores contain specific annotations directing the players. In spring, the violins imitate birdsong, named birds producing named sounds, the viola represents a sleeping dog, the solo violin is a sleeping goatherd. In summer, a cuckoo calls, a turtledove answers, a goldfinch adds its voice before the gathering storm. The storm itself arrives in the third movement as sustained harmonic tension that breaks into violent dissonance and then resolves. In autumn, peasants celebrate the harvest with a dance that gradually deteriorates into drunkenness. Hunters pursue a wounded animal across the final movement with a ferocity that ends in the animal's death. In winter, teeth chatter, literally, in the repeated notes of the violins, feet slip on ice, a person falls, gets up, and falls again. Then inside, by a fire, while rain falls outside, there is warmth. The music achieves these effects not through naive imitation but through a sophisticated mapping of physical sensation onto musical structure. The shivering of winter is not merely a tremolo effect, it is a tremolo effect placed within a harmonic progression that creates the specific unease of cold rather than the general unease of tension. The storm in summer is not simply loud music. It is music whose metric structure and harmonic rhythm produce in the listener something that functions physiologically like the experience of a storm approaching. Vivaldi understood that the body responds to music, and he wrote music designed to produce specific bodily responses. The opera impresario. Vivaldi considered himself, first and foremost, an opera composer. The instrumental concertos were the work he is remembered for, the operas were the work he cared most about. He claimed to have written more than 90, modern scholarship has confirmed approximately 50, with the remainder either lost or never completed, and he was involved in their production not merely as a composer but as a theatrical entrepreneur, renting venues, hiring singers, managing finances, directing rehearsals, and in at least some cases writing or substantially revising the librettos. His primary venue in Venice was the Teatro Sant'Angelo, which he managed for extended periods, and his operas circulated to theaters in Mantua, Vicenza, Rome, Prague, and Amsterdam. The operatic style he developed featured arias of considerable emotional range and technical demand, elaborate orchestral accompaniments that went well beyond the conventional continuo plus strings of most Baroque opera, and a theatrical energy that divided critical opinion sharply. Some audiences found his work overwhelming and brilliant, others, particularly in his later years as tastes shifted toward the lighter gallant style, found it overwrought and old-fashioned. The operatic work also generated conflict. Venetian authorities found it difficult to reconcile the activities of a theatrical impresario, a man whose business required dealing with singers, theatrical financiers, and the complicated commercial culture of the opera house, with the expected conduct of a Catholic priest. Vivaldi navigated these tensions with varying degrees of success and considerable stubbornness. He refused, essentially, to choose between the two identities the world had assigned him. Vienna, the death nobody noticed. By the late 1730s, Vivaldi's situation in Venice had deteriorated significantly. The musical culture of Northern Europe was moving toward the gallant style. Lighter, more transparent, more focused on melodic charm than on the structural complexity and harmonic density of the Baroque. Audiences that had once filled the Pietà church to hear his music now found his concertos repetitive and his operas too elaborate. His relationship with the Pietà itself had grown complicated. The institution's governors dismissed him in 1738 and rehired him in 1739, a cycle that reflected both his continued value and their ambivalence about his activities outside the institution. In 1740, at the age of 62, Vivaldi made the decision that would end his life. He sold a substantial portion of his manuscript collection, works representing decades of composition, at prices that suggest some degree of financial desperation, and traveled to Vienna. His intention was to seek patronage from Emperor Charles VI, who had met Vivaldi on a previous visit and expressed admiration for his work. It was a reasonable plan. It failed because of events entirely outside Vivaldi's control. Charles VI died on October 20, 1740, less than 2 weeks after Vivaldi arrived in Vienna. The emperor's death triggered the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict over whether his daughter Maria Theresa could legally inherit the Habsburg territories. And the Viennese court, suddenly consumed by a dynastic crisis and the prospect of war, had no attention to spare for an elderly Italian composer seeking employment. Vivaldi found himself in an expensive foreign city, ill, without patronage or income, and without the social connections that might have opened alternative doors. He died on July 28, 1741, of what the death register describes as internal inflammation. Probably a severe asthma attack, the same condition that had troubled him since birth. He was buried in a simple grave at the hospital burial ground, which is now the site of the Vienna University of Technology. The funeral was modest. The choir of boys who sang at it included one Joseph Haydn, then 9 years old, who would go on to become one of the dominant figures of the classical era that Vivaldi's death helped bring to an end. In Venice, where he had been the most famous musician of his generation, his death was barely noted. The notices were perfunctory. Within a few years, his name was largely absent from concert programs. The manuscripts he had not sold remained in private hands, their contents unknown and unplayed. For nearly 2 centuries, Antonio Vivaldi was, for practical purposes, forgotten. The rediscovery. The recovery of Vivaldi's music in the 20th century is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of musicology, a detective investigation that took decades and involved monastery archives, private collections, auction houses, and the sustained scholarly attention of people who recognized what they had found before the world was ready to agree with them. In 1926, a large collection of musical manuscripts was discovered in a monastery in Piedmont. The Italian musicologist Alberto Gentili identified the handwriting and style as Vivaldi's, an enormous cache of previously unknown works, including concertos, operas, and sacred music. Further investigation revealed that this was only half of what had once been a single collection. The other half was in the possession of a Genoese nobleman, the Marquis Durazzo. After extended negotiations, both halves were eventually reunited in the National Library of Turin, where they remain. Among the works recovered was the Gloria in D major, now one of the most performed pieces of sacred music in the choral repertoire, which had not been heard since Vivaldi's lifetime. The recordings that followed, particularly those by the ensemble I Musicai, whose recording of the Four Seasons in the 1950s sold in numbers that no classical recording had previously achieved, brought Vivaldi's music to audiences that extended far beyond the traditional concert-going public. The Four Seasons became, in the second half of the 20th century, probably the most frequently recorded piece of classical music in existence. It appears in films, in advertising, in shopping centers, in waiting rooms. It has become so thoroughly embedded in the texture of daily life that the specific achievement it represents, the mapping of physical sensation onto musical form with a precision that no composer before Vivaldi had managed, is easy to overlook. He was buried in a pauper's grave in a city that was not his own, by a church that could not decide whether to employ him or dismiss him, in a decade when the music he had spent his life developing was already being described as outdated. The music survived. It has now been heard by more people than were alive in the entire world when Vivaldi wrote it.